Welcome to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and I want to thank everybody for being here for tonight's epic debate. Tonight we have Professor David McQueen and Jackson Rowe, who are here to debate the important topic, the Genesis flood and Noah's Ark, fact or fiction. So obviously a very important topic. So I want to thank Professor McQueen and Jackson. I want to thank you guys so much for giving us your time for tonight's important debate.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome, Donnie. Thank you, Jackson, for joining with me in this discussion.
Yep, thank you.
My pleasure. So I want to point out, anybody new to this channel, anybody who's not yet subscribed, but you love debates, interviews, discussions, and more. We do a ton we've got a variety on this channel. Then please make sure to hit that subscribe button and share around this content, as the truth is important and critical thinking, healthy dialogue is important as well. So before we get into some introductions, though, I do want to go over a few reminders. We've got some really big debates over the next few months. I'm already booking for 2022. I'm just going to go over a few. As you can see in the upcoming events section, everybody, we've got a ton of events set. So I'm just going to go over a few here. We've got a good mix of science, eschatology, soteriology related debates. Next month, we've got a big one. Is limited atonement biblical? Matt Slick versus Joshua Gibbs, 2 seasoned debaters. First thing in 2022, first week of January, we've got 2 big debates. Does the New Testament teach that Jesus is God? Chris Date versus Dr. Shabir Ali. And that same week on the 7th, a debate on eschatology, pre-tribulation rapture versus post-tribulation rapture, Dr. Kent Hovind and Pastor Andrew Sluter. And at the end of this month, we've got a debate on Bible translations. Is the KJV superior to modern versions? Again, 2 seasoned debaters. This is definitely going to be a scholarly debate. Nick Sayers and Rob Rowe. So that being said, we've already got a great chat, and I want to go over the format for everybody, and then we're going to get some introductions from the debaters for the night. So it's going to be a formal debate. We've got 15-minute openings, up to 15-minute openings. Whatever's not used, as we typically do on this channel, we'll just throw into the audience Q&A. Then we're going to have up to 10-minute rebuttals, and then a roughly 35-minute open discussion where the debaters, Professor McQueen and Jackson, will be asking each other questions. As always, we keep these discussions sophisticated, equally timed, and respectful. Then we're going to have a 5-minute closing statement, and then an audience Q&A. So this is where we get you guys in the chat involved. So please make sure you're tagging me with your questions at Standing for Truth. That way I don't miss your questions. So that being said, enough for me. You guys didn't come here to see me. You came here to see Jackson and Professor McQueen. Why don't we give some brief introductions? Why don't we start with you, Professor McQueen? How you been? A little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I anticipate that there'll be new people that join our debate tonight. So I am a retired geologist, having worked for the last 50 years on and off in geology, full-time and part-time. I'm also a former university professor, having taught at Virginia State University, geologist there, teaching also on the West Coast. An important part of my background, for those of you that are watching what I'm doing tonight, and that is arguing that the Ark is historical fact, is that from 1983 to 1987, during that 4-year period, I worked for the Institute for Creation Research in what it was in California in those days. It's in Dallas now. And so my mentor was Dr. Henry Morris, and we'll be talking more about his view of the dimensions of the Ark. And then as we go through from the Ark to the actual flood itself, I'm sure Jackson will have some comments about that. I went to school at the University of Tennessee, undergraduate, University of Michigan graduate school. That's enough about me. Let me turn it over to Jackson, please.
I appreciate that introduction, Professor McQueen. Most people are familiar with who you are, but anybody that wants to see more from Professor McQueen, for one, check out our website in our About the Team section. You can find kind of biographies, information about all of us on Team Standing for Truth, as well as in the description box, I have the playlist from Professor McQueen, all the videos, lectures, presentations, and past debates that he's done with us. So definitely check that out. Also a link to his book, where you can find that as well. So Jackson, let's hand it over to you. Again, thank you so much for being here. A little bit about yourself,
Thanks,
a little bit about your channel, and how you been.
I'm doing good. I've been uploading videos again every now and then on my channel, Jackson Rowe, just my name. Used to have a different channel, but got some decent content, not great production value, and I'm not very charismatic, so I don't have that going for me, but you know. I've been recently hiring some guides all over the world, unrelated to this, to go out and look for endangered or thought to be extinct species. And I've actually had some success with that. I might talk more about that later. But found a new population of endangered species of gecko. Found a couple of rare tortoises in the wild. Well, I didn't. The guy I hired did. But anyway, got some interesting naturalistic science type stuff going on. So that's what I've been up to.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Jackson, you've had several debates now, your channel.
Yep.
I know you've got a lot of videos dedicated to this topic, which is good. You know, we've got two seasoned and knowledgeable debaters here. So it's going to be a ton of fun. The audience already is pumped. I'm pumped. So that being said, why don't we just kind of get right into it then? Jackson, we are going to be handing it over to you for your 15-minute opening statement. As always, whatever you don't use, of course, we will just throw into the audience Q&A. So whenever you're ready, on your first word, go ahead.
All right, I'll go ahead and start. Might take a while. I got a bunch of notes here, no particular order really, but let's start. All right, Noah's Ark is not meant to be literal in my opinion. I think the story loses meaning if you take it literally. By that I mean, if you take it literally, it's just about a guy who's building a boat. But if you read it as a parable, it's about a guy who follows through with what he was told to do by God in spite of all the people who mocked him. So that's what I think the story is really about. But the structure of the ark is really impossible for wood. Now, the ark was at least 450 feet long, but some say 500 feet long. Ancient Genesis built it 510 feet, I believe. Over 80 feet wide, 50 feet tall. And large wooden ships in recent history haven't fared well in rough seas. And I think a global ocean with catastrophic plate tectonics would be a very, very rough ocean. So I'll give an example. It's a common example. There are a few other less common ones, but I'm just doing the largest one. The Wyoming schooner, the largest wooden ship, at least in recent history, if the ark wasn't real. 350-foot deck length, 50 feet wide, 30 feet tall. So it was about 150 feet shorter than the ark. It was only kept afloat in rough seas with 90 iron cross braces and water pumps to expel water that still managed to come in. And it did stay afloat for years, but finally it did sink in rough seas. And that's a common theme with wooden ships over 300 feet. They tend to eventually sink in rough seas. Other similarly large wooden ships, the Ark Encounter, the Answers in Genesis Ark Encounter even had to use 95 tons of steel plates and bolts to get it up to code and keep the thing stable. Now, I mentioned rapid plate tectonics. This is what most creationists seem to believe, that all the continents were connected at the start of the flood and they rapidly moved apart during the flood. And by all accounts of what I've read, the energy from this would simply have pretty much destroyed the Earth. So Noah would have pretty much needed a spaceship, honestly. Now, geology, I won't touch too much on geology because that's Dr. McQueen's thing. But I will say that evaporite deposits really can't be accounted for in this, and they're in all levels of strata. Volcanic ash and lava flows, especially volcanic ash, can't be accounted for by any other means than volcanic activity. Limestone, I know you guys have addressed limestone before, but really it forms slowly. Shale even takes calm waters to form. Aeolian deposits obviously can't form in water, and they're in all levels of strata. Now, zoology, which is more my thing, most creationists argue that only family level would have had to have been on the ark instead of genus or species, but I think that wouldn't make any sense. I'll get more into that later. Inbreeding is a commonly brought up problem, which with only 2 of every vertebrate, that's going to get troublesome. Genetic diversity shows the opposite of what we would expect. By that I mean orcas, which wouldn't have had to have been on the ark, and therefore their population would have remained fairly large in the ocean. They have a low genetic diversity, whereas forest elephants, which there would have had to have been 2 on the ark, have an unexpectedly high genetic diversity, which is the opposite of what we would expect. Now, cheetahs and Tasmanian devils also have incredibly low genetic diversity, which indicates they were down to a few individuals in the past. But my question is, why don't all vertebrates show this evidence? Animals that do poorly in captivity, if we're going by family level, the pangolin is a good example. They eat ants and pretty much nothing else. And if you feed them anything else, they get digestive problems and they rapidly die. And they die of stress before that, even. They'll have heart attacks in captivity if not given a naturalistic enclosure. And dietary requirements for things like koalas. While it's true that koalas can eat other things than eucalyptus, it's very rare that they will. And they would still need fresh leaves for a full year, regardless. And I have a question that maybe I'll address later. How and when did dinosaurs go extinct if they were on the ark? That's something that I haven't seen any creationists address, I don't think. Now, humidity on the ark would probably be very high given the rain, the water leakage, the respiration, the feces from the animals. That would cause a problem if we're taking species level into account, like tent and geometric tortoises. These are from South Africa. They live in very low humidity environments. If they were on the ark, they would get respiratory infections within a couple of weeks and die very quickly. And kind of a loophole, if you will, that I found. If you bring 2 of every sex onto the ark, what do you do about the parthenogenic or hermaphrodite animals, like whiptail lizards? Some species are only female. Brahminy blind snakes, they're only female. Snails, they're hermaphrodites. So it kind of introduces a conundrum. Now, some people say invertebrates wouldn't have to be on the ark, but logically they really would. And they have short lifespans, most of them. Like Goliath beetles, for example, live for several months. Monarch butterflies live for 6 weeks. So you would have to breed them on the ark and care for their eggs and larvae. And the longest lived butterfly species, you could possibly argue against that, lives for 13 months, just barely over the line. The brimstone butterfly, but they would have had nothing to eat in that 13 months, so they all would have died anyway. Now, plants being submerged for a year would have killed most adult plants and their seeds. Past a couple of weeks, acorns will drown. Similar for pine seeds and most other conifer and deciduous seeds, flower seeds. I can think of a few plants that would do okay. Mangroves, coconut palms, they would probably live, but they would be the dominant plants on Earth after this. The Parasitaxis usta pine from New Caledonia. It's a parasite of only 1 tree species. It actually doesn't use photosynthesis. My question is, how did these seeds, assuming they survived, how did they find each other after the flood and start growing together? And After that, how did they find each other only on one island? Same goes for the Rafflesia flower, a giant flower. It grows only on the tetrastigma vine, so they would have to find each other after the flood, and that's pretty unlikely. Species distribution also makes no sense if the ark landed in Turkey. Marsupials, that's the most common example given, found mostly in Australia and South America, with one exception here in North America. Lemurs all found in Madagascar. The dodo bird found only on the island of Mauritius. Giant tortoises in the Galapagos. The Grand Cayman blue iguana in Grand Cayman. But even at sea, distributions don't make any sense. You would think that all sea turtles would be distributed globally after a global flood, but the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle is distributed in the Gulf of Mexico and on the East Coast only. And the flatback sea turtle is even more restricted, with northern Australia, the coast. And right whales are found only in the Atlantic, which is baffling considering they should be in every ocean. Now, the ark took decades to build. According to Answers in Genesis, it's 55 to 75 years, but some give even longer, up to 100 years. Wood decays even in dry conditions without upkeep and replacement. The average lifespan for a wooden deck is 10 to 15 years, for example, and wooden ships have a similar lifespan without upkeep and maintenance. So it seems to me that Noah would be replacing wood as fast as he's building the thing. More zoology just to interrupt the construction. The pygmy goby fish lives for 8 weeks. It's the shortest lived vertebrate on Earth, and they breed in coral reefs, which would have been destroyed by the plate tectonic movement and being submerged too deep. So they would have had nowhere to breed. So they shouldn't exist today if this flood happened. Now, octopus have a similar problem. Most of them live for 6 months to a year, so they would have to have somewhere to breed, and given the turbulence and turbidity of the water, they may not have a place to breed. On the ark, the giant Sunda rat lives for 6 months, so it would have to be bred on the ark. Labord's chameleon lives for 5 months, so it would have to be bred and then its eggs incubated on the ark, which would have been very difficult. It's difficult even today. Shrews live for 6 to 12 months, so they would have to be bred on the ark. Containing some animals on a wooden surface would have caused problems for some species, like elephants. In a confined space, they would have developed foot problems or even infections, especially on wood. Same with walruses and sea lions, which are semi-aquatic and couldn't stay at sea for a full year. Chimps and gorillas are escape artists. So in zoos, they have to actually weld screws in place, or they'll unscrew them and get out. That's how good they are at escaping. So I'm not sure how you're containing these in an ark. Once the animals are off the ark, they have nothing to eat because the plants have to grow back, and some ecosystems take decades to regenerate. But the carnivores probably would have immediately eaten most of the herbivores before that problem came up anyway. Now, why I think species would have had to have been on the ark and not genus or family, I'll give an example. There are 130 species of the Bolitoglossa genus salamanders. They take 10 to 12 years to reach sexual maturity. So in 4,000 years, these slow breeding salamanders are going to have to diversify into 130 species. And all tortoise species, 49 species that are known, are in the same family. I'll use 2 examples. The hingebacks and the spider tortoises breed very slowly. They lay a couple eggs a year. They take about a year to hatch, or the better part of a year to hatch. And not all of the hatchlings survive. So given the number of species and population sizes, it's really impossible for just 2 of these salamanders and 2 of these tortoises to have been on the ark. But let's grant family level was on the ark. Answers in Genesis says 7,000 animals total. The Fort Worth Zoo has about that number of animals. A 40-hour work week for 75 animal keepers there adds up to 3,000 man-hours a week, or 600 a day. That adds up to an impossible 75 hours a day of work for 8 people on the ark. Now, some of the food requirements. Elephants would need 200,000 pounds of food in a year for a pair, 730 pounds of eucalyptus for koalas, 100,000 pounds for a pair of hippos, 86,000 for rhinos, 1,400 pounds of meat for wolves, about 25 million ants and termites for an aardvark. They could eat the other things if they had to, I guess, but really pangolins would have no choice but to eat invertebrates, or they would get digestion issues. Now, some problems with the ark. Back to the ark itself. Lighting would have been an issue, and ventilation especially, with just one window as described in the Bible. So you would have high humidity and probably high temperature, which is a recipe for respiratory infections, especially given all the bat and bird and animal feces on board. Now back to wood decay. Again, took 55 to 75 years to build. So starting with the frame of the ship, in the years the frame would have rotted out and begun to at least fall apart. So the main structure would have to be rebuilt in a never-ending cycle. I'm not sure the properties of gopher wood as described in the Bible, but cedar shingles on roof have a 30-year lifespan with annual maintenance. Pressure-treated poles, telephone poles, have a 40-year lifespan. And again, Interest in Genesis says it took over 50 years to build. So even by modern standards with pressure treatment, you have an ark that is beginning to rot as it's finished, or not beginning to rot, it is rotting. Now, bristlecone pines, a different subject. There are 3 bristlecone pine trees that are known to be older than the flood. The Prometheus tree was cut down, sadly, and found to be 5,000 years old. Methuselah, which still stands, is 4,850 years old. In 2012, it was surpassed by a nearby tree that was found to be 5,060 years old. The fact that these trees exist at all means that there couldn't have been a global flood 4,400 years ago.
1 minute.
Okay, I'm probably not going to get through it, but let's see. The oceans would warm during this flood from the energy of the continents moving. But even if the continents didn't move, the ocean would become uniform in temperature. This would be catastrophic for krill populations. Populations of Antarctic krill would plummet from a warmer ocean, and tropical krill from a cooler equatorial ocean. Blue whales, for example, need to eat 16 tons of krill a day. So over this year-long period, krill populations are going to be devastated, and blue whales are basically going to go extinct. They really shouldn't exist today. Shallow ecosystems wouldn't have fared any better. Seagrass in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, for example. This would mean the dugong, a manatee-like creature, would have had nothing to eat for a year and would almost definitely starve to death.
10 seconds. If you want to wrap it up, Jackson, or was that the end of it?
I've got more, but we can wrap it up there.
All right, I appreciate that. I know 15 minutes can go by very quickly. We've already got questions coming in. So again, thank you everybody in the chat for being here. I appreciate the support, the super stickers and super chat. So keep tagging me with your questions at Standing for Truth. So that being said, we're going to hand it over to Professor David McQueen. Professor, you also have 15 minutes whenever you are ready. And if you, and I know there's a couple pictures and a video you want me to share, so you just cue me.
Yes,
and I'm good to
go. Jackson, I appreciate your careful look at all the different areas that you argue, from the book of Genesis being an allegory to issues of humidity and plants. I have some rebuttals for that, but I'll save that for the rebuttal part of our discussion.
All right.
Why is this so important? Why should Jackson and I take our time to look at this issue in the level of detail that we're going to over the next 2 hours? Well, let me suggest a way to think about things regarding this whole debate about Noah's Ark and also Noah's flood, which we may touch on. Let's begin with 3 points. The Bible provides data for us about the ark's dimensions and so forth. History provides data regarding Noah's Ark. For example, the World War II photographs that were taken and eyewitness sightings through the years. And then eyewitnesses provide data for the existence and survival of the ark on Mount Ararat. Let's start with the issue of the Bible providing data. And Jackson, I want you to realize that from my viewpoint, the Bible is a historical record, an inspired historical record. And so the argument that many make, McQueen, you and the other young earth creationists, you shouldn't view the Bible as something that provides you data and information because it's not a book of science. Well, it turns out if you go back to historical works like that of Tacitus and other of the Roman historians, they occasionally do talk about science in their book. They talk about genealogies and they talk about many other things. And so the fact that the Bible talks about genealogies and spiritual issues, in addition to what science we can glean from it, that's not a good argument. It's certainly not an argument, Jackson, that the Bible is allegorical. The vocabulary of the book of Genesis is not allegorical. Those of you that want to turn with me to Genesis chapter 6, one of the things that I want to argue, I'm interested to Jackson's rebuttal to this, is that the ark is spoken of in Genesis chapter 6. And in doing so, a tremendous amount of data that I'll use during the rebuttal part is given to many of the concerns that Jackson gave. Now, I'm not going to read except a couple of verses from Genesis chapter 6, and I'm going to summarize from there. In Genesis 6:13, we have the important issue of judgment. The reason Noah's Ark is important is that Noah's Ark is an example, an allegory to the saving grace of the Lord Jesus and the saving grace of God throughout the Old and the New Testaments. So it's not allegorical when God says this. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And then he goes on to give what I consider to be data. I'm not going to read verse by verse, but in 14, it does mention gopher wood. No one knows what gopher wood was. But as a geologist and as someone who studied chemistry, the next sentence there is terribly important. Rooms shall you make in the ark, and shall pitch it within and without with pitch. Whatever pitch is, whether it's a petroleum-related product or whether it is a substance from the trees in the pre-flood world, it provided waterproofing. And so as we look at the data that is talked about in Genesis chapter 6, let's go over it item by item. Gopher wood was used. Rooms were built. Certainly, these rooms, the Hebrew word carries with it the idea of nest, but maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing for a spider monkey to be walking around in the year-long flood. So, but it could have been encapsulated, so to speak. It was waterproof. We'll return in a moment to the 300 by 50 by 30 cubit size of the ark. There was a window up above. Now keep in mind that this window went most of the 300 cubits. And so the argument for ventilation is done away with when you realize, Jackson, that this window was that far. There was one door in the ark, which was sealed by God and then opened by Noah a year later. There were 3 decks, and food was brought on board the ark, enough food, I would imagine, by God's providence, to sustain the animals in the months after the flood was over. There were two of every kind of living, not living, two of every kind of animal that breathed, and this include insects and so forth. They had to be breathing. And judgment is a clear theme when you talk about the ark, the avoidance of judgment. And so one thing that I think critics like Jackson overlook is the actual end of Genesis chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Out of respect for Dr. Henry Morris, who wrote this commentary, I am reading from the King James tonight in our discussion. And so as I look at this list of items here, including the spiritual side of things, the idea that this was a judgment on a sinful world, and that the ark saved the 8 people and the animals from that judgment, I'm going to argue that the Bible provides data. My second point, as an introduction, is that history provides data. If Noah's Ark was as symbolic as Jackson has suggested, throughout history, there would not have been sightings of the Ark. I had an opportunity in 2008 to be part of an expedition that had a very specific purpose. Here's my field notebook from going to Turkey in 2008. I was invited to be a geologist on a team of archaeologists because a group of Christians in Hong Kong had thought they had been given a piece of wood from the ark. It turns out the wood that they thought they had was actually an igneous rock, and I was able to document that. Now, why would I even comment about this in a debate format? I debated with my fellow Christians that they made an honest mistake. It did look from a distance as if there was a grain, but it was a grain of an igneous rock, not the grain of wood from the ark. When I say history provides data, what I mean by that is World War II photographs have shown the ark. Now, Jackson may counter-argue, well, McQueen, if there are photographs of the ark on Ararat, how come you can't show us a picture? It is a frustrating aspect of this historical part. In the 1980s, I attended a conference on the ark in the Western United States, and I had the opportunity to hear speak and shake the hand of a man that was old at that time, but as a boy was taken by his family, Turkish or Armenian, to actually see Noah's Ark. So I believe there are eyewitnesses' accounts, and so the eyewitnesses provide data. So whether it's the Bible or history or eyewitnesses, we can see evidence for Noah's Ark. Now, help me to keep track of my own time and tell me how much time I've got left in my intro, please.
Good question, Professor McQueen. You've got 4 minutes and 10 seconds.
Okay, good. Now let's go into the issue of the size of the ark that Jackson has already discussed. And I'll use my forearm here as an example. Scoot back a bit. The cubit was the distance from the tip of your finger to your elbow. Now, Dr. Henry Morris, as he writes about the dimensions of the ark, is very careful to say this. Assuming the ancient cubit to have been only 17 and a half inches, which is the smallest except suggested by any authority, the ark could have carried as many as 125,000 sheep-sized animals. Since there are not more than 25,000 species of land animals known, and he includes here, Jackson, mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, he would suggest a very minimal size. Now, keep in mind that I have been mentored by Dr. Henry Morris, and so I'll use this 17-inch cubit, realizing that a man that I highly respect, Ken Ham, at the Grand Canyon, he and I hiked the canyon together. I spent a week with him. I have a tremendous amount of respect for his building of the ark there in Kentucky that Jackson referred to. He chooses a different size of the ark, so the ark ends up bigger. As a debate point, I'd prefer to use the smaller size. One way you can think about it is if you look at a American football field, it's 300 feet from goalpost, from end zone to end zone. And so the ark would have to be put sideways to fit in most, or diagonally, I should say, to fit in most football stadiums. The issue of it having 3 decks, we will see when we come to the rebuttal part, that solves a lot of the problems that Jackson was worrying about. Now, do keep in mind this, that if we use this figure of 17 inches, or we use the 1.7 feet in a cubit that Ken Ham has used, those of you that are international need to know this is about 1/3 of a meter, or 300 centimeters, 30 centimeters rather. And so whatever we argue about the size of a cubit, I want to argue for the rest of the hour and a half. Let's take the minimum values and use that as a issue. Do I have a minute left, Donnie?
Yes, you've got 30 seconds, Professor.
Okay. I'll end my introduction by beginning a critique of Jackson by saying the ark is not an allegory. Biblically, it would be called a type. It was a wooden vessel that saved, just like the cross of Christ is a wooden object that saved. Thank you, Donnie.
I appreciate it, David. That was perfect timing. 15 minutes from the both of you, Jackson, Professor McQueen. I appreciate it. We've got a great chat right now, over 60 people enjoying this debate. Questions are still coming in. Reminder, please tag me at Standing for Truth with your questions for the audience Q&A. So we are now moving into the uninterrupted rebuttal round. The rebuttals will be 10 minutes, and we're going to hand it over to you, Jackson. I will give you a 1-minute warning once we reach the 9-minute mark, just to let you know to kind of start winding things down. But whenever you're ready, you've got 10 minutes.
All right. You mentioned the ark on Ararat being found. To my knowledge, there have been a couple potential of those, but even Answers in Genesis doesn't really give much credence to it, as far as I can tell. I was watching a video the other day where they were talking about that. Ventilation with one window up top. There would still be stale air with just that one window. You would ideally need a second window, probably lower down, to get some circulation going. Now, history. At the time of the flood, you had ancient Egyptians and ancient Chinese writing their histories as this flood supposedly happened. You said 125,000 animals were on the ark, or could be on the ark, with 3 decks, but that's probably not taking into account food or water requirements. And then that's just size. You can cram every human on Rhode Island, I think I read somewhere, but that wouldn't really be comfortable. And you're not taking into account specialized animal diets or care requirements. Some animals just aren't going to survive in captivity, even today, like the Indri, the pink fairy armadillo, the pangolin. They're all not going to make it. Now, the Ark Encounter was constructed in a very modern way, obviously, but again, 95 tons of steel plates and bolts, 500,000 wood screws, cranes. There was really no way they came up with for an ancient family, well, not that ancient, but ancient, well, yes, ancient family to build it all by themselves. I've heard some people argue that they contracted it out, but that wouldn't make much sense to me because the Bible says everyone was scoffing at them, basically, so I don't know who would work for them. Now, that's what I got on the rebuttal, so I guess I'll just finish some of the points I have left from the opening statement. That's all right.
Yes, that's fine.
All right. The argument that animal speed or environment explains the order of strata makes no sense, as some people argue. I don't know if Dr. McQueen takes that stance, but animals like trilobites and modern sea urchins should be found in the same Cambrian rock, but they're not. Permian mammal-like reptiles and small mammals today should be found together, but they aren't. And dinosaurs can be much slower than modern mammals or ostriches or anything, but nowhere are they found together. Now, if we grant family and not genus level, here's a group of animals that would do poorly in captivity, as I was saying. The bumblebee bat, which is its own family, the suckerfoot bat, the honey possum, the pangolin, Indriidae lemurs, hummingbirds, penguins, numbats, Central American river turtle, Hoatzin or Hateson, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, warty snake, giant salamanders, Sicilians, the purple frog, and tarsiers. Just a short list. And reefs like the Great Barrier Reefs would have been destroyed by being submerged or the tectonic plate movement. Now, given growth rates, it would take at least 100,000 years for most reefs to reform, and even longer for the Great Barrier Reef. Now, let's see. That's all I got from there for now. So we can turn it over.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, Jackson. That's a few minutes there that we can throw into the audience Q&A. So let's hand it over to Professor David McQueen now. David, you have up to 10 minutes whenever you're ready.
Okay, I've got my timer started. Jackson, I'm troubled by so many of your arguments that I almost don't know where to begin. But let me get my clipboard and begin with your accusation that Noah would have to repair the ark as quickly as he built it. Now, the view of Noah's Ark that's portrayed in a lot of children's books is a little boat like this that is in the shape of a real boat, and you see giraffe and so forth sticking their heads out, and then in a more modern creationist book, you'll see dinosaurs sticking their heads out. Well, this is a silly way to think about Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is, as you correctly pointed out, took decades to build. And it was in the shape of a barge, not a boat like I just showed there. So what is the data we have from the historical book of the Bible? As I showed the data before, I can show it again later on. Here it is. Let's notice the things that present a rebuttal to what you're saying. It was made of wood, but it was waterproofed as it was going. So the pitch, this waterproofing material, whether it's from a tree or whether it's a petroleum product, tar, if you will, would have gone on the wood as the ark was being built. So a counter argument, a critique of your viewpoint, Jackson, is that there would have been no need 10 years into it to rebuild the lower deck because it would have rotted away. The pitch would have taken care of it. Now, could a vessel the size of Noah's Ark have survived the flood? Donnie's been kind enough to prepare for me a 1-minute video that shows the stability of the ark in a very violent aqueous environment, flooding environment. May we show that 1-minute video now, Donnie?
Definitely. Let me stop the timer real quick so I can share screen here.
Okay, good.
And I'll get the audio for people.
Thank you very much. Appreciate this. Watch this, Jackson. I think this might change your mind here. Those are the conservative dimensions we've talked about. Notice that it did not tip over.
In 2014, a group of master students at Leicester University decided to settle the question. They used the biblical measurements to calculate the size of the ark. Then they used the density of the water to figure buoyancy, and from there determined how much weight the ship could endure before sinking. Their conclusion? Noah could have put 70,000 animals on board and the ship would have floated.
And what do you know? It floats.
Okay, let me continue my rebuttal. And I'm going to write down that number, Jackson, so we can talk about it more. They claim that there might be 70,000 individuals on board the ark. One of the things that creation science have argued since Dr. Morris began speaking about this in the 1950s is the average size of an animal on board the ark. Even if you take the dinosaur fossils we find and you do an average size of those dinosaur fossils, most dinosaurs are actually quite small. As a matter of fact, truth be told, a lot of these dinosaurs are the size of a rat, not a sheep. Dr. Morris always assumed the average size was that of a sheep. But let's go to the other end of the argument. You know that one of the comments that my opponent made, and let me get down to it here, is the idea of humidity killing many of the insects, geckos, and so forth. Since there was water stored on the ark, and one very good thing that Ken Ham's group in Kentucky have done is shown how these cisterns might work on board the ark. The needed humidity could have been provided by the water that was being moved through the ark to water the animals. So that issue, I believe, goes away. He commented about the lifespan of monarch butterflies and other insects. So 2 of each kind of butterfly fluttered in, and he's made a good point that we need to discuss whether it was at the genus level or the species level. I think that for my purposes tonight, we'll look at the different genera of animals, butterflies, snails, and so forth. But let's take this one example of a monarch butterfly. Absolutely no problem with these creatures reproducing on board the ark, since we argue that the ark was needed for 12 full months. And so that is not a problem. Dr. Henry Morris, and I'd encourage you to go back and read this, Jackson, if you have not, in the 1961 book, the Whitcomb and Morris book. Dr. Henry Morris got a tremendous amount of help from a botanist named Lambert. And he had done quite a bit of study, actually, about soaking different kinds of seeds in water, which he put in his garage, apparently for a year, and then they would germinate afterwards. So that is one counter argument that I would give. Secondly, I think Jackson is falling into the trap of so many people in believing that essentially Noah and his 3 sons and his wife and the 3 daughters, the 8 people, were foolish or ignorant of many things. I would counter argue that there was genius in ancient man, and as they prepared to take every bit of food that they needed on board the ark, they were careful to realize that the kind of food that a certain type of creature would need, like a penguin, for example, would be different than the food that would be needed for a lion or a tiger. Furthermore, they
2
could
minutes.
have taken. Say it again.
You've got 2 minutes, Professor McQueen.
Thank you, sir. They could have taken their own seed on, not so much to make bean soup while they were on board the ark, but to plant afterwards. The seeds that Jackson argued would die or could not produce certain things could have been taken by the 8 people and their descendants worldwide after the time of the Tower of Babel. Fascinating point that he made about the right whale being only in the Atlantic. Well, as a flood geologist, looking at the rocks that are predominantly in blue, we'll focus on them. The N stands for Nashville. The C stands for Chicago. These are flood rocks, rocks from the time of the Great Flood. So I certainly believe there was one world continent that broke apart during the time of the Great Flood. And so when we look at whales as they are today, the fact that right whales are only found in the Atlantic is a characteristic of the post-flood world. It speaks in no way to the conditions in the pre-flood world. How much time there, Donnie? Is it close?
Yes, you've got 15 seconds.
You take it over, my friend.
I appreciate that. I know these rebuttals fly by. 10 minutes does not feel like 10 minutes. So I appreciate the opening statements and the rebuttals, Jackson and Professor McQueen. Time really flies by. We've got a great chat, some great questions. We have hit the hour mark. Therefore, what we can do is just take a few minute break in order to be ready and I guess energized for the discussion portion. We will be asking each other questions. So if we wanted to do a few minute break.
Yes. And Jackson, I'm looking forward to getting my questions for you, my friend. Could you drop my video and let me take a 5-minute break here? And absolutely. I will be back to discuss with my opponent.
Take your time. Take your time. Okay, well, while we are on break, since we've got a lot of new people in the chat, what I'll do is just go over a few reminders for everybody. We've got some big debates coming up, a good mixture of theology debates, soteriology, eschatology, science, the nature of God, so on and so forth. I'm trying to get you guys a strong variety, I guess you could say, of topics. So next month, I'm extremely pumped for this one, is limited atonement biblical. So we've got a debate on the extent of the atonement. Is it universal or limited? Matt Slick versus Joshua Gibbs. Both of these seasoned debaters have been here before, so that's definitely going to be one to remember. First thing in 2022, does the New Testament teach that Jesus is God? Chris Date versus Dr. Shabir Ali. Again, two very, very seasoned debaters. Both Chris and Dr. Ali are professionals, very scholarly, so that's definitely going to be an epic debate. Closer to the end of this month, we've got another awesome debate here. Was Jesus God and man? Fully God and fully man during his earthly ministry. CJ Cox versus Stanley Terry. We've also got an epic debate on Bible translations and textual criticism. Is the King James version of the Bible superior to modern versions? So Nick Sayers and Rob Rowe from Sentinel Apologetics will be debating that topic. The King James only controversy. So that's going to be a ton of fun. We've also got Jackson Rowe. Jackson Rowe is going to be back here next month for his much anticipated round 2 with Dr. Kent Hovind. They're going to be debating this time the same topic, the Genesis flood and Noah's Ark, fact or fiction. Last month they debated, is there evidence for human evolution? Tons of great feedback on that debate. I think it's sitting somewhere near 6,000 views already. Again, we've got another awesome nature of God debate in a couple weeks. Is God one or three divine persons? Again, two very seasoned debaters, Stacey Turbeville and Kelly Powers, two debaters who have been debating this topic for years and years and years. That's going to be awesome as well. Check the event section because I must have 20, 25 events scheduled there. So please check that out. Big main event first thing in January. Eschatology, one of my favorite topics, pre-trib versus post-trib, the rapture debate, Kent Hovind and Pastor Andrew Sluter. So that's definitely going to be a ton of fun as well. So that being said, guys, please make sure you are tagging me with your questions. We are going to be having an audience Q&A. The format for tonight has been 15-minute openings, 10-minute rebuttals, which we just concluded. We're now going to be moving into the roughly 35 to 40 minutes discussion portion where Jackson and David will be asking each other questions pertaining to the topic. During the openings and rebuttals, a ton of interesting points worthy of discussion. In-depth discussion, I would say. So definitely this discussion is going to be one to remember. Then we're going to have 5-minute closing statements and an audience Q&A. We always have good audience Q&As here. So yeah, make sure you are tagging me. So that being said, we are just going to be on break for another couple minutes and we'll see you in a minute. And we are back. Professor
Back and ready to
McQueen,
go.
good to see you. Jackson, good to see you as well. Okay, so as I said, we're moving into the discussion portion. We like to keep it as equally timed as possible, of course, sticking to one topic at a time. I will be watching the time. I'll keep you guys posted on that. If I need to jump in at any point, I will. But that being said, let's jump right into it. Jackson, Professor McQueen, the floor
Yeah.
is yours.
You know, since Jackson is about the age of my own sons, I'll let him go first. Ask me a question, my friend.
All right. Let's see. You mentioned monarch butterflies breeding on the ark. So Noah would have had to have grown milkweed. Is that correct?
If the modern monarch butterfly does indeed eat milkweed, then growing milkweed in soil that he brought on board the ark during that 12-month period, I don't think would have been a problem. Now, of course, he could have brought on board live plants. And again, I go back, Jackson, to the fact that the Bible is a historical record. And in the passage that I referred to, if you want to go back and reread Genesis chapter 6, he very specifically instructed Noah to bring on board the food that would be needed. Now, in most of my debates in the past, my opponents have talked about lions and tigers and dinosaurs and so forth. So I very much appreciate you bringing up the issue of insects, because it's an area that I don't think a lot of my creation science buddies have spent a lot of time in. But I will counter argue that when you deal with something like how the insects might have lived, how snails and other creatures might have lived, I think that if we give Noah the credit of decades to think about it, and the fact that God was leading him. Now, keep in mind that he did not gather the butterflies. They flew in the door of the ark. So that would be my answer to your question. Stop my timer here. Okay. May I, Donnie, go on to my question for Jackson?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
When you have presented this argument about the humidity requirements for the different creatures on board the ark, are you aware that some of the modern depictions, if you will, of the ark, and I went to my workshop and brought a piece of wood to show. Now, what I need to do before our next debate is actually cut this thing in the ratio of 300 to 30 to show its stability. Donnie, would you mind pulling up that PowerPoint slide that shows how the ark is at the middle of comfort and stability? Donnie? And I'll keep on talking until you pull it up there. So my question for you, Jackson, is again, here it gives you a sense of the size of it. And I'm arguing that it's even shorter than 500 feet. But the next slide, Donnie. Yeah, here's a very interesting thing. If you look at the dimensions of the ark, it finds a balance between stability, strength, and comfort. Jackson, how would you counter argue that diagram? Go ahead and drop it so we can see his face.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily argue against the fact that it's not proportioned correctly. I'm just saying that a wooden structure 400 to 500 feet long, depending on what interpretation of a cubit you're taking, would be a very unstable structure. Not necessarily the shape, but the material it's made out of. If it was a steel ship, I would say it's fine.
Well, let me build on that. Does it influence you at all that the ark was waterproofed both inside and out? See, when I have talked about this in the past, and I've been studying this for 50 years, I've always emphasized the fact that it was waterproofed on the outside. Let's call this the outside part of the ark, in order to keep it waterproof from the waters of the flood. And then inside it was waterproofed in order to preserve it through the thousands of years until Marco Polo and other people saw it in the mountains of Ararat. But our discussion has opened my mind to another possibility. Perhaps another reason that it was made waterproof inside and out, or especially if it was a tarry substance, it would keep it from rotting, which you presented as one of your critiques. What do you think of that idea?
Could be that the tar would keep it from rotting, but the oceans would be so turbulent and the ark so large that I don't think any amount of waterproofing is going to keep the thing together. Well, the catastrophic plate tectonics.
Let me counter argue that. The video that I showed that showed the model of the ark being stable as those waves were passing through, doesn't that provide a reasonable explanation for how the ark could have withstood the violence of the Great Flood?
Well, it can show that it wouldn't capsize, but it would still be thrown around quite a bit and flexed back and forth in these waves, being such a huge structure.
Okay. And you have brought up a very good point. From my viewpoint as a geologist who's also a Christian, a young earth creationist, when I go back to the actual historical account from the book of Genesis, I come over to words like this. And in Genesis, I'm looking for Genesis 8:1. Find it here. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And God remembered Noah and every living thing, all the cattle that was with him on the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and so forth. Now, it's not as if God forgot Noah, but the Hebrew word remembered there is that God was fulfilling his promise. So, Jackson, when you argue that the violence of the flood would have caused a problem in tearing the ark apart, I go back to the fact that this was a actual event where the creator of the universe watched over Noah and the members of the members of his family and the creatures on board the ark, and preserved them in the same way that God provided salvation to me and all the rest of the Christians that have ever lived, and believers, Old Testament believers, not in what you call an allegory, but an account of God's loving grace going through the 6,000 years of our earth history. Will you even admit as a logical possibility that a creator watched over the ark during the violence of the flood?
Well, that would really be the only explanation as to how the ark could have stayed together, I think. But I don't believe it's a literal story. No.
Let's go back to an argument that you've given about the dinosaurs on board the ark. And let me use two of my models from my grandchildren. First, the knight in shining armor riding on horseback. And let's talk for a moment. Take the human off the horse. So the genus of horses, as I recall, Jackson, is equus. And so how many different kinds of horses would need to be on the ark when they came to Noah? I would suggest that something that you and Donnie have studied quite a bit, the whole idea of the gene pool of animals. I find it fascinating that you are initiating a study of endangered species around the earth. But how many different kinds of horses would need to be on board the ark? I would argue that you'd only need a male and a female, because in the same way that you can take a dog with a very extensive gene pool and breed from that dog over a very short period of time, everything from the huge horses that pull the beer wagon all the way down to the Shetland ponies of Scotland, you could breed that in the time after the flood. What is your thinking, Jackson, about the number of animals, just from the standpoint of your interest in biology, that would need to be kinds on the ark? Would he have needed 20 different kinds of horses, 20 different kinds of triceratops? What's your thinking about that?
Well, in most cases, I think you would need the species level because, as I illustrated with the polyglossa salamanders, they have such a slow reproductive rate, and then they have to diverge into 130 species over the course of 4,000 years. And that's from a genus, not even the family, which most creationists argue was the level on the ark. They're plethodontid salamanders. So that's a whole different problem. And they breed fairly slowly.
Those of you that are watching this debate may have walked into the room thinking that nothing that I say would change Jackson's mind tonight, or that nothing that he says would change my mind. Now, as far as Noah's Ark being factual, you'd be right. And concerning Jackson, nothing that I say tonight would immediately turn him into a fundamental Sunday school teacher this coming Sunday. But I am, Jackson, showing you the respect of writing down this salamander issue. Give me that example again of how long it takes for that particular salamander to speciate.
They reach sexual maturity at 10 to 12 years, and there are 132 species, I think.
Okay, what's the name of the salamander?
Bolitoglossa is the genus.
Spell it for me.
I would have to look.
Well, just what letter does it begin with?
B, Bolitoglossa.
Okay. I have a buddy locally who's did a lot of work on salamanders. Goes to the Great Smoky Mountains, flipping over rocks looking for salamanders. I will ask him this question about these 132 species. My thinking, one thing you need to know about me, Jackson, is that over the years I've taught college and high school biology. So from what I know, whatever salamander kind was taken on board the ark could have, in the years since the ark, the thousands of years, developed 132 species. Even with this 10 to 12 year maturity issue that you brought up, I don't see that as a huge problem. Now, critique what I just said. Am I missing something here?
Well, I'll give you another example of the tortoises, which are even slower to breed. Many of them reach maturity at 20 years. Some of them lay only a couple eggs in a year. And of those eggs that hatch, only not even 50% probably survive to adulthood. And some of these tortoises are originally numbered in the millions. So
Okay, let me comment about that, and I'll use a Bible word, a theological word, and that is the idea of providence. God providentially brought the kinds of tortoises to the ark that could, in the post-flood time, end up being the kinds of tortoises that Darwin found on the Galapagos Islands. I know you've been there and have seen them with your own eyes.
yeah,
Let me challenge you with another issue that I find fascinating, and that's the issue of dinosaurs on board the ark. Most will recognize this dinosaur from your study, the Stegosaurus. These plates here are examples of the intelligent design of the creature to provide ways to dissipate heat. But let's talk about the ones of these that came on board. If you go to the kind of charts that children love to color in, and you look at Stegosaurus, which is on this side, let me get a size from the other side of my chart here. It says that Stegosaurus is almost 8 meters long or 25 feet long. Now, let's approach this in two ways. And Jackson, I'd like your reaction to it. If what we're saying is true, here you've got a creature that may be 7 meters long, two of them. Would there have been enough room on board the ark? And the answer, I believe, is yes. A creation scientist named John Woodmoraphy has done a feasibility study on the ark, and this is available at the websites. I have talked with John. Woodmoraphy's real name is Jan Petchkus. He studied this out in Chicago for many years. What Petchkus points out is that you could do all the different animals, the food, the water, and everything, and have at least a third of the ark left over. And so if we deal with adult stegosauruses, there'd still be room. But let's look at it another way. What if God, as he brought the creatures to the 8 people, brought them simpler children and adolescents to deal with? As a father of 4, I've raised 4 human adolescents, and I know that would be tough on board the ark. But what about juvenile and I won't use the word baby because they couldn't very well walk there, but juvenile dinosaurs as an answer to the size problem? Do you find that rings through? That rings true, Jackson?
well, the problem with that is they can tell from sauropod humerus bones, I believe, the approximate growth rate. And
Yes.
within a year, they're getting pretty big and they're consuming a lot of food. So I think there's still a problem with that.
The counter argument that Dr. Henry Morris began using in the 1950s and certainly through the 60s was the counter argument of hibernation. Almost every creature that breathes air can enter a hibernation period. Even the most biologically challenged people that are watching this debate know about bears hibernating, and their metabolism slows down and so forth. And so I would think, whether we're talking about horses or dinosaurs, that the issue of hibernation might be a way to be a partial explanation of how 8 people could have tended this many people, this many animals. The argument that you gave last hour about the number of people that it would take to in a modern zoo to handle these creatures, I think that's not a good argument because, again, as you correctly point out, it's foolish to think that they had to work 40 hours in a 24-hour day. Does the idea of hibernation ring true to you, Jackson?
Well, to force all animals to go into hibernation at once would be a supernatural explanation. So, I mean, without that, there's not much.
And again, from my viewpoint, a supernatural explanation is not problematic. I'm taking too much time. Jackson, go ahead and ask me a question, and then we'll come to this axis deer here in a minute.
You're all right. Let me see. You mentioned penguins.
Yes.
Well, the penguins have a new problem. Even if they were hibernating, they would probably overheat. Even equatorial penguins, the Galapagos penguins,
Yes.
most heat tolerant of all of the penguins, they compensate for that by having the water being incredibly cold. The Humboldt Current comes up past Chile and into the Galapagos and keeps it cool from the southern current. As you mentioned, I've been there and I've swam in that water. It's incredibly cold. It's way colder than you would expect. So we would have a problem with the penguins.
Okay. Let me counter argument the penguin and the cool water. Modern creationists that have studied the architecture of the ark, the naval architecture of it, can imagine a system of piping and cisterns of water adequate to provide the initial water needed, even to cool the penguins down as it would move down to their pen, cage, or nest. Now, a critique that you've already brought up is the idea of catastrophic plate tectonics, the heat that would be produced by that, and the nature of the rainfall. Now, do keep in mind that from the biblical data, there was no rain after the first 6 months. And so as we move to the latter 6 months of the flood and the latter part of that first 6-month period, whatever volcanic ash or whatever sulfur dioxide might have been in the water as it was raining down on the flood on the ark could have been neutralized by that time. So there's no lack of water to provide water for the people and the animal on board the ark to drink or to cool down the penguins that you're making reference to. Let me post an idea to you, Jackson, and see how you would think of it. One of my friends locally grows deer. Now, this is an axis deer skull that I have here and horns and so forth. The white-tailed deer is most common in the southern United States and is the common deer that is hunted. He has studied, or he collects the DNA from all these different type of deer. But what I want to emphasize are the horns on this thing. Do you think that it would be awkward for Noah and the 7 others to have to deal with an animal as it might be even a juvenile that would have what are called spikes here as people hunt them, or a full-sized axis deer? Once again, with the size of the ark, I see no problem with an adult deer walking on board the ark with his wife, his female. But again, if we allow God to speak the truth, that there are 2 of each kind, 2 of each genus, as I've said, he could have brought on board or instructed to go to the ark a deer that were juveniles. As you think about the counter arguments that I've given about the ark being big enough for all these creatures, you think that's a reasonable idea, Jackson?
Well, I think they would be crammed in pretty tight. But
Well,
yeah,
I would.
sorry,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
I would immediately disagree with the idea of being crammed in pretty tight. This fellow, John Wood Moraphy, uh, uh, Jan Petschkus, have you read his several hundred-page book called The Feasibility Study for Noah's Ark?
No, I haven't read that. I probably should.
That'd be a good book for you to pick up because he points out in there an actual disagreement with Dr. Henry Morris regarding several things. He disagrees with Dr. Morris. For example, Dr. Morris uh, calculated that there might have been as many as 1 billion people alive at the beginning of the Great Flood. Petschkus thought that the number really should be 100 million. But one thing that we might want to discuss and do I understand, Donnie, we're close to when the audience may ask us questions? How close are we to that time break?
We've got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Maybe we'll discuss that then. One question that I want to uh, pose to Jackson is a biological question about the death of animals, whether animals or men float or sink. We'll save that for the next round. Jackson, you want to bring an additional item up for me, please?
Yes, it's kind of related to that. Why do we not find trilobites and sea urchins in the same strata, do you think?
Okay, let me use my map behind me here as an example. Again, the N, and maybe if you made it full screen, the audience could see it better, Donnie. The N is Nashville, Tennessee, Chicago, Mississippi River is here. The yellow rocks in this area are post-flood rocks. Some of the rocks up here in Minnesota and so forth are pre-flood rocks. Let's focus for a minute on the pink and the blue. The blue rocks are rocks that contain coal measures, the coal seams in America. The pink near my thumb here contain trilobites and other fossils that are invertebrates. If we imagine the Great Flood occurring as we have been talking about it, my opponent, I think, is overlooking the fact of what's called ecological zonation. As the flood waters rose all over the earth, the floodwaters would bury logically the sea creatures like trilobites that are bottom dwellers and so forth, and then animals such as dinosaurs and camels and so forth could escape to higher zones. So there's an aspect of escape, but there's also an aspect of these creatures being buried in ecological zonation. Does that ring true, my friend?
Well, let's give flying animals an example. Bats, birds, pterosaurs, and so-called feathered dinosaurs like Archaeopteryx or Confuciusornis or something like that. Why are these all not found in the same layer if they all were able to outfly the flood?
Well, I guess part of my response there is you do find in the Western United States fossil graveyards where there are different genera in the same rock type. So I would suggest you don't have your facts completely right, because there are cases where several different genera of both aquatic and terrestrial animals are found in the same layer. Donnie, how much time now until the next cycle?
If you want, based on what I have here for the time, why don't we get one more question from each of you, one from Jackson, one from Professor McQueen, and then that will take care of the final few minutes we have for the discussion. Then we're going to move into some closing statements.
Okay. Jackson, let me go first here and ask you a question based on one of the arguments you have brought up. You have argued that the right whale, the modern right whale, is found only in the Atlantic. I would challenge you to tell me how whales could have evolved in the rock record. I'm sorry, as evidenced as fossils in the rock record. How could whales have evolved? Dr. Duane Gish used to make fun of his opponents by suggesting that somehow a cow fell into the water, both male and female, reproduced long enough so that the whale could evolve. What evidence do you see in the fossil record for whale evolution?
I think there are about 48 species from Metcadius to Basilosaurus. So about 20 to 30 species of lobe whales. You have Metcadius at the front, about 55.8 million years ago. And it goes to Pachycetus, 50 million years ago. Ambulocetus, 48. Myocetus, I think 45 million years ago. You're getting progressively more aquatic as time goes by. Then you have animals like Basilosaurus, obviously, that are even creationist degree are whales, but they don't have very modern whale features. They have a few different types of teeth, whereas modern whales only have one. They have no melon. They have a nostril.
Okay, I can see where your argument's going.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that more later. Go ahead and ask your question of me, my friend.
All right. Sorry. Let's see. Yeah. How do you account for the history of, say, Egyptians and ancient Chinese written history going back during the time the flood supposedly took place?
Okay. You bring up a very important point, and that's the chronology of archaeology. What I do is I use this as a basis. Any structure like the roof of a temple, the Egyptian pyramids, the pyramids in the Yucatan Peninsula, any human structure like that, I put as post-flood, because any structure that man made in the time before the flood would have been destroyed by the catastrophe of the flood. So the way that I handle that argument is the Chinese language developed after the time of the Tower of Babel, and the Chinese language contains many clues that point back to the Bible, like a very large vessel in Chinese contains the characters "boat saved 8 lives." So all of these things date to post-flood time. I don't accept the fact that the culture in China or in South America matches what Bishop Usher and others considered the date of the flood. I think Usher was right. The modern archaeologist is wrong.
Let me jump in there, Jackson, Professor McQueen. That's time for the discussion portion. I want to say fantastic discussion, very civil and sophisticated. So many great points discussed, and really just a great debate so far. An hour and 40 minutes has flown by. So therefore, let's do this. Let's move into the closing statements. You both have 5 minutes. And so if there are any, let's say there's any points that you guys feel like you want to address before we move into the audience Q&A, feel free to take this time to kind of complete your arguments, complete your thoughts, and then we'll get into some audience questions. So, Jackson, we're going to hand it to you first, though. You did start us off in this debate with your opening statement. So you have 5 minutes. Let me just get my timer ready. I apologize. And you're good to go on your first word. I'll start the timer.
All right. I probably won't need all the time. I'll just say I enjoyed this debate. Very civil and respectful. I have respect for David McQueen. And we're actually talking about meeting up sometime. I want to do that. I think that would be
me too.
Good idea. Yeah. And I'm going to give Donnie my mailing address so I can have a copy of your book. Also,
I'll be glad to send it to you, my friend.
All right. And just anything else I said would just be going over my points again. I just think it's an allegorical story. I don't take it for literal. And I think most of the explanations would have to be supernatural for it to make any sense at all. And there's just no naturalistic way for the story to happen. So I'll just leave it at that and turn it over.
All right, Jackson, thank you so much for that 5 minute closing statement. Well, as I said, whatever we don't use, we just put into the audience Q&A, because as usual here, we got a lot of great questions and therefore a lot of good discussion to be had. So Professor McQueen, we're going to hand it over to you, and you have 5 minutes whenever you're ready.
Okay. The foundational argument that I've given is that the Bible can be trusted as a historical document. And the issues that are at stake, and the reason I'm motivated to debate this issue with my opponent, can be found in 2 Peter chapter 3. I'll begin with verse 3 of 2 Peter chapter 3. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? And so in this context, I would argue that my opponent is a scoffer in the sense that he believes that the Bible is allegorical. He would say the same thing about Jesus as he said about the book of Genesis. It's just an allegory. Jesus can teach us about love, but he wasn't the Son of God or anything. But listen to this argument. Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. The mistake that my brother is making is that he's uniformitarian and materialistic. He believes that a naturalistic argument that basically the rates we see today are the rates that were there in the past completely overlooks the catastrophic nature of the Great Flood. But focusing in on Noah's Ark, it completely overlooks God's grace in the covering of that ark. Let me read on. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in water. So this focuses on the creation, a topic for another debate perhaps in the future. According to, I went too far there. Whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And so this talks about the millions of humans, the millions of animals that were destroyed. Why? Because of the sinfulness of mankind. So we can't lose focus on the fact that the ark is a symbol for the salvation through the Lord Jesus. But I would like the audience to consider this final warning, which is quite serious. I'm a father of 4, grandfather of 9. And so I've seen a lot in my life. Consider this. But the heavens and earth, which are now, by the same word are being kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and the perdition of ungodly men. So God's concern about the sinfulness of mankind in the past is no different than his coming concern that we all have to give an account for what we think. Is it fact? Is it fiction? Is it allegory or is it history? Thank you.
All right. I appreciate that closing statement there, Professor McQueen. Jackson and David, thank you so much for the awesome debate. This is definitely a must watch. So people in the chat, please make sure you are sharing this around. Again, David and Jackson, thank you so much for doing this. So that being said, let's just get right into the questions here then. Looks like we've got a decent mix of questions for the both of you. As we typically do on this channel, whoever the question is for, we will make sure they get the last word. Let's say the question's for Professor McQueen. We'll give David you a chance to answer it. Jackson, of course, we can get your thoughts on it as well. And then we would give David the final words. So that being said, let's go right to the first question. And this one came in all the way at the beginning from Landon Freeman. This question is for Jackson. He says, Jackson, have you considered that Noah's Ark worked simply because of divine intervention?
Yes, I have, but it's really not a good explanation if you're looking for a scientific answer for it. So, if I was going to believe the story, it would need to have some ring of naturalism in it, I think.
All right, I appreciate that, Jackson. Professor McQueen, go ahead.
Okay. So the issue here is naturalism versus supernatural. And I would recommend to Jackson and also the audience in general that they go back to C.S. Lewis's well-known book called Miracles, a Preliminary Study. In that book, he addresses this issue of naturalism versus supernaturalism. Now, as a scientist, I've been looking at the Bible for 50 years, and I think one of the things that would resolve your concern, Jackson, is the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. In the New Testament, one of Jesus's friends, Lazarus, died while he was away. His two sisters, Mary and Martha, were so very concerned about the death of their brother that they said, "Oh, if Jesus had only been here, he would have been saved by Jesus. He wouldn't have died." Well, when Jesus finally got there, he had them roll away the stone. That was something that the humans could do. And then Jesus said, "Lazarus, come forth." Now, what's interesting about that? If he'd just say, "All the dead come forth," then as God, all the dead around the world would have come forth. But he had to speak Lazarus' name. But when Lazarus came out, he then turned to the humans there, his friends, and said, "I've done what only I can do. Now you do what you can do." And his sisters and others unwrapped the body, and Lazarus lived. Now he died in the future, but he was resurrected on that day. How does that tie into this argument? It ties in this way. God had to make sure that the ark didn't float over the top of a volcano, subaqueous volcano, as it erupted. So God did his part. But the details we've gone over that are covered in Genesis 6, 7, and 8 of what Noah did do, building it a certain dimension, waterproofing it, That was something that man could do. So I think that the mix of naturalism and supernaturalism that you're looking for, Jackson, can be found in the Bible.
I appreciate that response, Professor McQueen. Jackson, the question was for you, so go ahead. You get the final word.
I don't really have anything to add. We can go to the next one.
All right, I appreciate it, gentlemen. So this next one comes in from Ryan, the Raptor guy. I appreciate the question, Ryan. He says, question for Jackson. Question is, how do you account for marine fossils found all over the continents, not just mountains, without a global flood?
Well, again, I think different parts of the world have been underwater at different times. I think that's evidence through geology. That pretty much every place on Earth has been flooded at one time, not necessarily the same time. So that would be my explanation.
All right, I appreciate it. And Professor McQueen, we'll hand it over to you.
Okay. My counter argument, I'll put underneath the idea of naturalism versus supernaturalism. And this is one of my worries about misunderstandings that people have about fossils being found all over the continent and so forth. As many of you have seen me do before, if this is a mountain and I've drawn a tree there to one side to show you that this is a cross section, a lot of people have the false idea that as the floodwaters receded, the fossils, indicated by the F there, are kind of stuck on the side of mountains. But rather, let me draw this in better here. It turns out if you go to a place like Everest and other places, the fossils, that almost looks like the letter E, so let me mark that out. The fossils are found in the rock strata. Many geologists use exactly the argument that Jackson gave, that there have been so many regional and local floods that we can explain these fossils being all over the earth and all over every continent. If you look again at the map behind me, the kinds of marine fossils that are found in the blue area, going from Chicago all the way down to Nashville, are found in rock units. So it's a clear evidence that tsunami-like waves brought marine animals all over the continents. Okay, Donnie, back to you.
Thank you for that response there, David. Jackson, if you would like a final quick word, go ahead.
Well, we still have the problem of why is not one dinosaur fossil found with, say, an Australopithecine or vice versa? You know, why is a pterodactyl not found next to a modern bird? I would think it would turn up once in this mix of plate tectonics and global flood, but it hasn't yet. Maybe someday, but I doubt it.
All right. I appreciate the question from Ryan and the engagement and responses from both David and Jackson. So let's move on here. We've got a question from Shelly. Shelly, I appreciate the question. So again, question is for you, Jackson. I appreciate you being a good sport, Jackson. As a matter of fact, it looks like most questions are for you. So the question is it contradictory to believe that the present is the key to the past, yet animals that exist today were primitive eukaryotes going back far enough in time?
Well, let me see if I understand the question. We can kind of see back in time through fossils and genetics. So if I'm understanding the question, that's kind of my answer.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Professor McQueen.
Let's start with the fossils. As a geologist, I've studied these for 50 years. I'll leave the genetic issue to others. But let's look at the fossils and dissect one of Jackson's concerns. He looks at the fossil record and he says, okay, if you flood geologists are accurate, how come we don't find a dinosaur in the same layer that we find, for example, a dog? So once again, I need to draw on here my tree, which indicates that this is a stratigraphic unit out in the western United States. I have hiked the Grand Canyon 5 times in 4 years when I was at ICR. And I've looked, and sure enough, the trilobites at the base of the canyon are not mixed in with the reptile amphibian footprints at the top of the canyon. There are 2 explanations I would give to Jackson for the fact that you don't find dinosaurs and dogs in the same unit. A dinosaur, even though some would disagree with me, is kind of like a Louisiana alligator. I don't choose to live near where the dinosaurs are. So my family dog, which has been domesticated as far as we can have in recorded history, and probably was true in the pre-flood world, my family dog is not going to be around the dinosaur. And so, again, the argument is basically an argument of ecological zonation. We don't find a pterosaur and a modern bird in the same unit. The birds and the pterosaurs, for that matter, both breathed air. So 2 of each of those kinds were on board in the ark and lived in the post-flood time. But the birds and the pterosaurs that were alive before the flood would have been killed for a number of reasons. Let me give you an example of one. A bird like a robin or a cardinal, for example, would be flying around, and as the floodwaters fell, the first 40 days of the Great Flood, the windows of heaven were open. They would have been knocked down into the ocean and would have been eaten by the marine creatures that were out in the ocean, plesiosaurs, creatures like that. But not just that, but other animals such as sharks that are carnivores. And so that is how I would expand on that argument on why you would not find them together.
I appreciate that response, Professor McQueen. Great questions that are coming in. Jackson, that was a question originally for you, if you'd like a final word on that.
Yeah, he points out kind of a problem with ecological zonation. He mentioned that trilobites are on this level in the Grand Canyon, then you have reptiles and amphibians up here, but they're on top of each other. So one was wiped out, and then it dried out, and then another one came in and was wiped out. That doesn't track to me.
All right. Well, moving on. I appreciate that, Jackson. We've got a super chat. So I want to get these super chat questions in. Jungle Jargon, I appreciate the support and the question. So he says hard question, not specifying anybody. So we'll just consider it a question for the both of you. We'll give you both an opportunity to answer this, then we'll move on. So Jungle Jargon's question is, why are there, and I've got it up on screen, why are there matching fossils between continents? Living animals between continents, and glacial markings going south to north in India. Whoever would like to start, Jackson, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll start. I think because the continents were connected long ago, and that allows animals to walk back and forth from what was South America and Africa, which were at the time one, just one example. So that would be why fossils are found on both now of the same basic animal.
Thank
Okay.
you, Jackson. Go ahead, Professor McQueen.
I'll go ahead. Now I'm putting a north arrow on here to show South America and Africa. If I can draw the letter F there. So there's South America and Africa on my diagram there. And we have found a point of agreement between Jackson and me. I believe that the Bible indicates there was one world continent. Now, that continent, if you put it together, had a basic C-shaped, and again, this is north, a basic shape of the letter C if you were to look at it from space. But when that began to break up, when that one world continent began to break up, there were catastrophically, there were units laid down that contain these fossils that are asked about. And these rock units, which I'll put an X here, if you put the continents back together, if you put the South America and Africa back together, they do match up along those dotted lines when you put them back together. Now, obviously, they're separated now by the South Atlantic Ocean, but I think catastrophic flood geology provides a better explanation for the presence of those fossils on the two continents. The issue of glacial markings on bedrock in India is a topic more complicated than we have time tonight to talk. So I'm going to defer on that.
I appreciate the responses from the both of you, and I appreciate the great question and super chat from Jungle Jargon. So the next question here comes in from, let me see, it's a super chat, so I'll put it up on screen. Whoops. There we go. Alec Cox. Again, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the support, Alec. He says to Jackson, what are two best evidences for evolution, fish to man in brackets, that we are still observing and not some past theory based on a rock finding?
Oh, morphology and genetics, I would say. And that's
okay. If he doesn't want to elaborate on that, I'll elaborate on that. So your two points, one of which is the argument based on morphology, and by that I figure you're talking about homologies between a bird's arm and a man's arm. Is that what you're talking about? Or am
Not
I
necessarily homology, but similarities between like primates and other animals and that sort of thing.
Oh, okay. Okay. That is something I can speak to, morphology, and let's use DNA as an example. So my counter argument to that is when you look at the modern world, you certainly cannot see any evidence of evolution occurring now. Now, I have to put a caveat there. I'm not talking about at the species level. I'm not talking about one being able to look at a certain type of bacteria, observe it as it goes through 1,000 generations, and see that there's no change at all. Often there are mutations that occur that cause that bacteria to look different. What I'm talking about is all the work that's been done by both the evolutionary community and also the creationist community on the issue of DNA. You can go to ICR's website and you'll find some remarkable arguments there. And also, if you go back to some of the talks that Donnie has given since Christmas of last year, you'll find that the similarities between something like a gibbon or a chimp or other primates and man is not nearly as close as the evolutionary community has reported. And even if it is the case, and I know this is not true, I'm going to use it for the sake of the debate. Let's say there's only 1% difference between a chimp and a human. We have to ask ourselves, is there junk DNA in that human DNA? The answer I've gotten from Donnie and other biologists is that no. What appears superficially to be junk DNA to explain something about the morphology of apes versus humans is not really junk DNA at all. There's more data, there's more information stored than we give credit to.
Thank you, Professor McQueen. And Jackson, did you want a final word on that one?
Yes, we are 1 to 2% different from chimpanzees in the sense that the regions that code for proteins in our DNA are identical. I just wanted to add that.
No problem. No problem. Okay, as we wind down with the last couple questions here, because we did just hit the 2-hour mark, and I want to respect the time of our debaters tonight. So this one comes in from Wesley Coleman. I appreciate the question, Wesley. He says, row. So I'm guessing it's for you, Jackson. He says, delicately preserved fossils, polystrate trees, sand injectites, and warped strata are all signs that these layers were laid down quickly. Is this not physical evidence?
Well, delicately preserved fossils can be formed in many ways. Mudslide, falling to the bottom of an anaerobic bog and being preserved that way. Polystrate trees, they typically happen in like fossil river deltas. So they are a catastrophically formed thing most of the time, polystrate trees. But you'll notice there's never like it's never going through the Triassic and the Jurassic. What they're defining as that. It's always in one layer of strata, technically, not multiple layers. As for warped strata, I don't know much about sand injectites, so I'll just go to warped strata. When the rock is still hot and deep under the earth, it can warp and bend there and then be pushed up over time and give you that appearance. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Jackson. And we'll hand it over to you, Professor McQueen.
Okay, my counter argument to that, and Jackson, you and I'll have to meet in Middle Tennessee sometime in the future along I-40, and I can take you to a place where there's you standing there beside this polystrate tree that goes through some coal measures, and there's a tree at the top to illustrate that it's a cross section. The argument that I was presented, and perhaps you've been tricked by, is my professors would say, oh, that's not a big deal. These coal measure peat bogs, they slowly formed over time. And so when I saw this with my own eyes in the past, I said, wait, what are you saying? Could this have formed through slow processes? The answer is no. It had to be a catastrophic formation. Now, I congratulate Jackson because he mentioned that even in his context, this has to be a local catastrophic event. John Mackay and others have found these kind of trees in Australia, in Europe, in America. And so my challenge to Jackson is, if you begin to go worldwide, and find evidence of what even you consider to be local catastrophic events, how can you argue against a worldwide catastrophic event that lasted 12 months?
Thank you for that response, David and Jackson. Did you want a final word on that one?
Sure. Well, I think catastrophic local events happen all over the world all the time. We see that even today. I just don't see the evidence that one is responsible for all of this 4,400 years ago.
Okay, I appreciate that, David and Jackson. So this question here comes in from Richard Madsen. I appreciate the question, Richard. This one's for you, Professor McQueen. So he actually, it looks like it might be for the both of you. So he says, if I divide 7 by 2, a male and its female, referring to the Noah's Ark story, he says, I get 3.5 females and 3.5 males. So he's asking, were there 14 of the clean animals?
Yeah. Let me start on that to show the ridiculousness of that argument. Again, let's go back to the data that we have in Scripture, and let's look at that very thing, or rather, let's find that exact passage that he is talking about there. This is found in Genesis chapter 7, and I'll read the first 3 verses. And the Lord said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I found righteous before me in this generation. And again, the issue of sin and righteousness comes to the forefront. But let's focus on the 7s and the ridiculous argument that this individual made. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and female, and of the beasts that are not clean by 2, male and female. Of fowls of the air by 7s, the male and female, to keep seed alive upon the face of the earth. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, it gives you the basis for this understanding the 7. Of course, it was 2 pairs, male and female, male and female. So there were 3 females, 3 males, and then the 7th of the beast was a male, and the 7th of the birds was a male, because God always provides a provision for people that don't have much money. And so throughout the Old Testament, an appropriate sacrifice for someone with not much money would be a bird. And if you got more resources, it would have been a beast like a bull. If you read the complete story and go from Genesis 6, 7, 8 to chapter 9 and chapter 10, you'll find that when Noah got off the ark, what did he do? He sacrificed an animal to the Lord. And so that's where that 7th one came in. The clean animals, and the clean birds for that matter, could have been barbecued on board the ark, so long as he didn't take the last 2. So you see the way it works out. 2 of each Brahma bull are saved to get off the ark, but the others are eaten by barbecue, or barbecued. That's what I would do. Barbecued each Friday night. I hope I didn't add ridiculous to ridiculous. So that's my
No, I appreciate the response. Thank you, Professor McQueen. Jackson, did you want to add anything to that at all?
No, I don't think I have anything to add.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. We are coming at the 2 hour and 15-minute mark. That was a great audience Q&A, a great debate. So I really appreciate it. Time has flown by. Jackson, Professor McQueen, fantastic job. Before we do shut it down and call it a night, though, I want to give you both the opportunity to, give some final thoughts, some final words. Why don't we start with you, Jackson? Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for
Yep,
doing
thank you.
this. Final thoughts, final words.
I'll just kind of repeat what I said in the opening statement or the closing statement. That it was a respectful debate, and I respect David McQueen. And I don't know who won or lost. I don't think anyone really knows. It's kind of subjective. But I enjoyed it either way. So I'll give it over to David.
And once again, I want to compliment you. And as soon as you send your address to Donnie and then he communicates it to me, I'll be sending you an autographed and inscribed copy of my book to say thank you. But not only to say thank you, but the argument that I give in the book about how minerals are an example of God's creative design might be of interest to you. As I said,
I'll read it here.
Thank you. As I said earlier, Jackson and I both have things to work on. I'm going to go to my salamander expert buddy and check a couple of things that Jackson has brought up. And I hope that he will think through the following argument. I think it's a very important issue to think through what the building of the ark means. We have in the Bible enough data to show that this ark was not a little bitty tiny boat with giraffes sticking their necks out, that this was a floating barge with adequate room for food, water, waste, even the humidity issue that he's brought up. Secondly, not only is there data in the Bible, but I'll point out that there's data in history that Marco Polo, a number of people in the years since the flood have seen Noah's Ark, including observations during World War II by United States aviators. It's a legitimate area of research. How come we can't find these photographs? Well, there's quite a number of books that have been written. One is by Tim LaHaye and John Morris dealing with the ark. Another one by a fellow named Richard Bright about the ark, that you can study this out more. The final point I want to make is the spiritual side of it. The head of the National Geographic Society years ago, when asked what would be the most amazing archaeological discovery of the 20th century, he said, if we could find Noah's Ark above 14,000 feet on a volcanic peak in eastern Turkey, that would confirm the biblical story, and would confirm the historicity of the Bible. And so, wouldn't that be an amazing thing that between now, Jackson, and our next debate in the new year, that could be found by one's exploring? Thank you to both of you.
I appreciate those final words, Professor McQueen and Jackson. We've got a lot of compliments, a lot of great feedback in the chat. We've had a great chat all night. We had over 70 people at one point enjoying this awesome debate. So again, Professor McQueen, Jackson, thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Donnie, I want you to know I'm going to go ahead and X myself out. Jackson, I'm going to go out to the local stream and turn over some rocks, see if I can find those salamanders you were talking about.
All right.
So I'm going to leave the room and leave it to you two. Thank you, gentlemen.
All right. Good talking
God
to
bless
you.
Professor McQueen. God bless Jackson. God bless everybody in the chat. Thank you for being here. If you're not yet subscribed and you love debates, discussions, and lectures, please make sure to hit that subscribe button, because if you go check the event section, we've got a ton of fun for everybody over the course of the next few months. So that being said, again, thank you so much, Jackson. Thank you, David. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for all the support. and super chat, super stickers, and great questions. God bless. Standing for Truth is out.